Adesso ascoltiamo una lezione da parte del professor Luke Macnamara, che come vedete è un monaco benedettino del St. Patrick College, dove lui lavora, Maynooth, in Irlanda. Allora è interessante il personaggio perché si chiama Luke. E come Luke, come il Luca della tradizione nostra, prima di essere, diciamo, servitore della parola, è stato servitore dei corpi, ha fatto il medico. E quindi è proprio, diciamo, interprete di due dimensioni di misericordia, quella corporale e quella spirituale. E poi come Paolo, di cui lui è studioso anche, ha viaggiato. Paolo da Tarso è andato a Gerusalemme, poi da Gerusalemme è andato in vari posti, fino a Roma. Beh, anche Luke ha fatto un po' così, ha studiato a Parigi, ha studiato in Irlanda, ha studiato negli States.
Non negli States, in Israele, Gerusalemme.
Ha studiato a Gerusalemme, ai piedi di Gamaliele. Poi perfino a Roma ha studiato, quindi ecco con il professore Béchard. Questa, diciamo, pluralità di apporti, di incontri è molto, molto importante per i nostri studi e la vediamo anche testimoniata qui nei nostri incontri dove ci sono provenienze diverse, approcci diversi che arricchiscono la nostra intelligenza del testo biblico. Ricordo del professor Macnamara la sua pubblicazione principale, che è la sua tesi, Paul Outside the Walls. Scusa. La sua tesi sugli Atti 7 a 15, che sono il lavoro su praticamente la caratterizzazione di Paolo in questa parte degli Atti degli Apostoli. Ecco, adesso ci presenterà appunto qualche cosa che è il frutto un poco di questo suo lavoro, ma poi anche degli studi seguenti, proprio sulla figura di Paolo, ecco, negli Atti. Il suo approccio sarà quello di mostrare appunto gli studi più recenti in questo proposito, i diversi aspetti, le diverse componenti significative dell'Apostolo Paolo. Grazie.
Grazie Padre Bovatti. Devo scusarmi prima di non parlare in italiano perché con l'accento è un po' più doloroso per voi che sarebbe in inglese. Okay. The figure of Paul in Acts, I will start with the introduction, has interested generations of scholars. Father Bovatti has mentioned that I would do the recent studies. I will just give a little background in the first page or so. So the focus of this paper is an overview of the scholarship of the past 50 years, especially the last 30 years. It is now over 50 years since the influential work by Wildhauer comparing the theology of Paul's authentic letters with that of his speeches in Acts. The differences noted in Acts led to a reconsideration of Luke's purpose in this contrasting portrait of Paul. Wildhauer's position has been critiqued for an over-reliance on the speeches in Acts, to the neglect of the wider Lucan portrait of Paul, when performing his comparison with the theology of the letters. Nevertheless, the differences discerned in the theologies sparked renewed interest in the Lucan portrait of Paul, as reflected in the many publications of the subsequent decades, several of them from this house. 2. The late 60s and early 1970s saw a renewed interest in the portrait of Paul in Acts, particularly in the German-speaking world. This period was marked by redaction and composition criticism. The studies evolved in two directions, one examining the role of Paul in relation to the 12 apostles, the route taken by Gunther Klein and Burchard, the other examining the figure of Paul in the context of the relationship between Judaism and emerging Christianity, the route taken by Jervell, Löning, Stolle, and Maddox. Klein notes that in contrast to the Paul of the letters, Luke restricts the group of the apostles to 12, thereby reducing Paul's importance. This subordination is the supposed price of rescuing Paul from the clutches of the Gnostics wishing to claim him. There is, of course, a bias here in that Luke's notion of apostolicity is automatically linked to that of Paul's letters, and that all discrepancies then become Lucan tendencies. Bourchard also compares Paul with the 12 and attempts to overcome the discrepancies through the category of witness. Bourchard, unlike Klein, does not compare the Acts with the letters, but through the use of redaction criticism on the Damascus accounts, Acts 9, 22, 26, examines the Lucan reception of the Pauline tradition. He notes that the two later accounts are call narratives and include terms used by Luke elsewhere for the apostles, especially that of witness. Bourchard brought to the fore the importance of this term and function for the Lucan Paul, which is very much in evidence in recent studies. A significant shift occurs with Jacob Jervell, who stresses the Jewishness of the Lucan portrait of Paul. This is observed in his personal devotional practice, his missionary practice of preaching in synagogues, and the goal of the salvation of Israel. While many commentators would contest what they see as an excessive emphasis on the Jewishness of Paul, and particularly of the mission, Jervell represents an important corrective, especially to the earlier neglect of the continuing Jewish mission, alongside that to the Gentiles. Since Jervell, it is no longer possible to discuss the Lucan Paul without considering the portrayal of his relationship to Judaism. For Löning, Luke's Paul plays a key role in the problem of discontinuity between Gentile followers of Jesus and Judaism. All of Paul's activity reveals the refusal of the Jews, and only then does he go to Gentiles. This is explained further in the judicial process, Acts 22-26, where he displays the Jewish discontinuity with the promises and the past. In contrast, his own behavior is exemplary. Maddox views the Lucan Paul as an exemplary figure of a persecuted witness of Jesus, whose career is marked more by being a persecuted witness, Acts 21-28, than missionary, Acts 13-20. He is a bridge figure between the generation of the apostles and the third generation, represented by Luke. For Stolle, Paul in his prolonged trial, Acts 21-26, is both a defendant and a model witness to Christ. In these roles, he addresses both those within the Jesus movement who may lack faith and fall away, and also the external menacing opponents. The increasing opposition and the prolonged trial provide further opportunity for evangelization. Stolle rightly emphasizes the Christological portrayal of the dependent Paul through a close study of the interconnections of the three accounts of the Damascus event. The first one, Acts 9, anticipating the witnessing and suffering of the later two, while the later two refer back to the first account of the meeting with Christ. Number 3, Paul in the last 30 years. The increasingly voluminous study of Paul in Acts, while not quite a storm center, is complicated by an array of conflicting results from scholars. The most common approach, even today, is to examine both the letters and Acts in an attempt to recover historical details to reconstruct a historical Paul. The various phases of the quest for the historical Jesus have maintained and stimulated interest in the historical Paul. The tide has ebbed and flowed in the estimation of the historical value of Acts for this research, but in all cases, the Paul is a hybrid, mescolanza, a Paul of the Acts and a Paul of the letters. Historical questions have their place, but preemptive attention to the historical information on Paul from the letters distorts Luke's specific portrait of Paul in Acts. This large body of scholarship will not be reviewed in this presentation. Priority will be given to those works, already very numerous, which examine the Paul of Acts exclusively. He deserves the stage by himself. Furthermore, many scholars present different historical reconstructions for the author, his community, and his first intended audience, and these result in diverse portrayals of Paul. Adherence to the narrative portrait and pertinent contextual history has a better chance of allowing Luke's Paul to emerge. It is useful and instructive to compare and contrast the Lucan Paul with the Paul in the letters, but before embarking on this, time, space, and focus must be directed towards a literary or narrative examination. Despite the continued historical quests, the past 30 years have seen a decisive move from consideration of purely historical questions towards literary and narrative questions. Although the focus is no longer on the historical events of Paul's life, but on the referential history or narrative world of the Lucan account, these approaches, especially in more recent times, consider relevant contextual history which helps inform their readings. The early criticism of these methods as being ahistorical, whilst once valid, is no longer so. When examining the Paul of Acts, successive stages of exegesis, source criticism, form criticism, and redaction criticism, have tended to privilege certain sections of the text over others. The most recent of these methods, redaction criticism, particularly favored the threefold account of the Damascus experience and the speeches, where Luke's redaction is most readily evident. More recent methods, narrative, rhetorical, and semiotic analyses, are employed to good effect on these same texts and also more recently on the conclusion of Acts. Contemporary scholars, although they effectively deploy the tools of various new methods, often persist in the practice of favoring certain sections of Acts while neglecting others, also leading to a partial view of Paul. Number 4, the classification of recent studies on the figure of Paul in Acts. The studies that specifically consider Paul in Acts may be divided according to the sections of the text they examine and to the perceived interests they discern in the Lucan presentation of Paul. The study of Paul in Acts is usually restricted to 4 sections: the Damascus experience, the missionary journeys, Paul's period in Roman custody, the end of Acts. And studies that focus on Lucan interests may be broadly classified as paranetic and apologetic. These categories are not mutually exclusive, and Lucan interests are often discerned in the studies of distinct sections, and some studies observe both paranetic and apologetic interests. Nevertheless, it is a useful classification for a broad and heterogeneous body of scholarship. The pertinent literature will be examined under the following headings: studies that focus on the Damascus experience, studies that focus on the missionary journeys, studies that focus on Paul's period in Roman custody, Luke's paranetic interests, studies that view Paul as an emblematic figure, Luke's apologetic interests, studies that highlight the legitimation of Paul, and studies that focus on the end of Acts. 4.1, studies that focus on the Damascus experience. In these studies, most attention is given to the Damascus experience and its subsequent retellings. The 3 accounts are often examined together or synoptically, blurring both the specificity of the first account, Acts 9, and ignoring its narrative context. Earlier studies designated this episode Saul's call, mostly on the basis of information adduced from the later accounts. The current tendency to designate the Damascus experience as Saul's conversion is problematic at several levels. It implies an interpretation of events which is not objectively warranted, and betrays the narrator's avoidance of any one genre for this episode. Elements of several genres have been identified, but the episode defies classification. So the reader is left rather to question what exactly has happened to Paul. Further, this synoptic approach does not address the narrative following the first account, and so the delay in fulfillment of expectations, namely the mission to rulers and Gentiles, 9:15, is neither detected nor examined. This approach is exemplified by Burchard, Löffing, and Löning, who trace the relationship between the 3 accounts to discern traditional and redactional elements, and thus ascertain how Luke portrays Paul. Stolle illustrates well the tendency to neglect the wider narrative context. Although he accurately identifies the Damascus experience, including the early ministry in the city and at Jerusalem, as the exposition of Luke's portrait of Paul, he posits the fulfillment in the later defense speeches. However, there is already much fulfillment visible in the prolonged partnership of Paul with Barnabas. The above scholars are followed by narrative critics who, although they examine the accounts in their narrative contexts, persist with the synoptic tendency of viewing them together to study the effects of redundancy and variation. Flichy presents the three Damascus accounts in sequence, producing a synoptic résumé of Paul's character before examining Paul's missionary journeys. In a recent contribution on Paul in Acts, Macnamara, who we had yesterday, announces his project. It will be a matter of progressively discerning what Luke invests the character of Paul with, what issues he adds to the image of Paul as the narrative unfolds. However, shortly thereafter, he examines all three accounts of the Damascus event together before examining Paul's missionary journeys, thus contravening his set program. Although Tannehill focuses on Paul's entire ministry in his commentary on Luke Acts, he examines the prediction to Ananias, which previews Saul's future role, together with the announcements of his mission in the later Damascus accounts, and the other predictive statements of his role in Acts. Tannehill's analysis goes both forward, previews, and backwards, reviews, and too quickly discerns fulfillment, thus often failing to investigate the intervening gaps and their possible functions. Most recently, Wilson reads the three accounts in relation to ancient conceptions of elite masculinity. Paul is unmanned, reso femminile, in Acts 9 by losing key components of masculinity, namely self-control and his sight. Although in the two subsequent accounts, Paul continues to convey significant lack of control over his own person, he nevertheless portrays himself as more manly. Readers who have access to all three accounts view how Paul, from his own perspective, adapts the narrator's authoritative account for the later Jewish and elite Greco-Roman audiences. Wilson summarizes, Luke portrays masculinity as adaptable but ultimately grounded in dependence on the powerful yet persecuted Lord. While this reading is stimulating, this model of masculinity might prove challenging or even dissuade the excellent Theophilus to whom Luke Acts is addressed. It certainly does for this reader. This also contrasts with the portrait discerned by Conway, building upon the work of Lentz, that Paul and the other major followers of Christ are portrayed as educated, articulate, reasonable, self-controlled, pious men, capable of holding their own in the upper echelon of the masculine world of the Roman Empire. Whilst these narrative approaches demonstrate the interrelationship between the three accounts and between them and their respective contexts, the relationship with the wider narrative context is lost, especially the long section between the first and second accounts, 9 to 22. These studies contain distinct limitations, at times blurring the emerging portrait of Paul at this early stage by references to the later accounts. Some who have included Paul's prolonged backstage period in their analysis distinguish three phases in the relationship between Paul and Barnabas. Raymond designates these from Paul's perspective as les premiers pas, l'émancipation et l'indépendance. Euler designates the phases from Barnabas' perspective as mentor, Missionskollege, and Streit. These phases in Barnabas' relationship with Paul are missed by those scholars who examine isolated sections of the narrative. 4.2, studies that focus on the missionary journeys. Relatively few studies on Paul in Acts examine his role during the first missionary journey. Some attention has been given to Paul's performance of wonders and miracles. Jervell has noted the prominence of miracles and suffering in Paul's ministry in Acts and already in the first missionary journey. His study discerns a more complex portrait of Paul on this first missionary journey as a visionary, charismatic preacher, healer, and miracle worker. Most attention, of course, is centered on the speech at Pisidian Antioch, with Paul thus principally seen as a preacher. Scholarship has moved from attempts to separate tradition, Dodd, from Lucan composition, Dibelius, to adopting a more narrative approach, examining the text structure, context, and reader's response. The monograph of Flishy views Paul as missionary to the synagogue and to pagans in the events at Pisidian Antioch and Lystra, respectively. But she omits to examine the mission to Cyprus, the summary at Iconium, and the return journey. Both Flishy's monograph and Tannehill's commentary view the missionary journey as fulfillment of the prediction to Ananias, but especially as programmatic, Flishy, or representative, Tannehill, of Paul's future missions. They fail to trace the stages or dynamic of fulfillment and instead anticipate events that have yet to be reached by the reader in a sequential reading of the narrative. There is frequently a failure to question why fulfillment should occur now and not previously. A recent study has noted the development in Paul's character as he progresses on his first missionary journey. However, it does not treat the reader's expectations from the earlier period in Paul's career, and thus does not fully discern the evolution in Paul's character. As for the first missionary journey, the speeches have attracted most attention for the second and third journeys, especially the speech at Athens and also the farewell discourse at Miletus. Flishy confines her examination of Paul in the second and third journeys to a speech to the pagans at Athens, examined in conjunction with the Lystra speech, but omitting the important, as we learned yesterday, near and wide narrative settings. The well-crafted speech at Athens in an august setting and to an equally august audience, despite the limited response, significantly raises Paul's status, with many viewing him as a latter-day Socrates. However, the speech reflects Paul's double heritage and draws upon both Septuagintal and Hellenistic philosophy. In all three missionary journeys, the relatively neglected narrative sections have been granted greater attention in studies attentive to literary conventions, sociocultural scripts, etc. In addition to the exposition of Luke's use of ancient socio-geographical models, Béchard also demonstrates how Ovid and Diochrysostom are used by Luke in Acts 14 to legitimate Paul and to characterize the Lystrians as rustics. This focus extends to recent studies on Lydia and the jailbreak in Acts 16. Luke employs but modifies literary conventions of foundation of cultic locales to validate Paul and his Gentile mission. MacDonald suggests that Luke is providing an alternative to classic literature from Acts 16, and especially the speech at Athens onwards. Many broad and debatable parallels, and I insist upon debatable, present Paul as an alter Dionysius or Socrates in order to legitimate him. Pereire's redactional critical study of Paul at Ephesus shows that he preaches here for the first time to Jews and Gentiles outside the synagogue, which represents the climax of the universalism of the mission in Acts. These studies and others, though their focus is elsewhere, have, through their attention to previously overlooked passages, shed more light on the Paul of Acts, and usually vindicate him in some way or undermine his opponents. 4.3. Siete ancora vivi? Sì, bene. Studies that focus on Paul's period in Roman custody. As elsewhere in Acts, scholarly attention has principally focused on the speeches, which here occupy a more significant portion of the text. Paul is portrayed through the defense speeches as possessing far greater rhetorical skill than Peter and John. Furthermore, Paul exhibits his legal acumen and competency in the witness box. While these capacities greatly enhance Paul's status in the eyes of readers, they are due to divine empowerment rather than personal gifts. Jervell notes that in contrast to Peter and Stephen, Paul's defense speeches include much autobiographical material, and that this is to show Paul's continued fidelity to Judaism. Indeed, despite the Roman trial, Paul's speeches are directed more towards Jewish concerns and attempts to show how the resurrection fulfills Jewish expectations. This portrait is challenged by Stolle, who emphasizes Paul's role as a witness, especially in the defense speeches in Acts 22-26. Noting the many links with Jesus' trial, and particularly the connections with the speeches, Stoller views Paul, along with other witnesses, mainly Peter and Stephen, as prolonging the witness of Jesus. This subjugates Paul, and indeed Peter and the others, to Luke's Christological purpose. Many studies regard this section as legitimating Paul and his mission in response to various difficulties, either within or outside the early church. Some interesting contrasting portraits may be noted at this point. Lentz presents an analysis of Paul examining his social standing and moral status. The double citizenship of Tarsus, and especially Rome, being a Pharisee and of Pharisaic lineage, all suggest an individual of very high status. In addition, the expected deprivations of custody are largely absent. While this study does well to recognize the elevated stature of Paul, it fails to take into consideration contrasting elements elsewhere in the narrative noted by others. For instance, Rosenblatt views Paul as a persecuted witness and representative of the beleaguered missionaries and suffering members of the Jesus movement. In contrast, the narrative study of Skinner, rather than speculating about the effect on specific ancient audiences, examines how Paul's custody settings differ from what one would expect. Paul continues to exercise a witnessing function with relative ease. Paul's custody setting is a place of proclamation rather than suffering, as for Maddox. In a later work, Skinner speaks of Paul, that is Matthew Skinner, I should make precise, because there are several Skinners, speaks of Paul as moving from accused to defendant to judge, reflecting the overall theme of Acts of the inevitable progression of God's word. The portrait of Paul in custody is of a competent witness who exploits every setting to proclaim the Lord to very diverse audiences. 4.4. Luke's paranetic interests studies that view Paul as an emblematic figure. Some scholars consider Paul an emblematic figure, most commonly a witness or a Christological figure who might serve as a model for the Lucan church community. In the 1970s, there was a pronounced tendency in German scholarship to view Paul as a witness, Zeuge. The identification of this specific trait or aspect of Paul led to a thematic approach to the study of his character in Acts. Scholars amassed all the information pertinent to the above designation and tended to neglect others. The designation once made, Paul is observed to be a witness from the start of his career as disciple. However, the designation as a witness comes only much later in the narrative. Acts 22:15, etc. In fact, Paul at Pisidian Antioch speaks of others, those who accompanied Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem, and to whom he appeared after his resurrection as witnesses for the people, 13:31, rather than himself. Learning, although his study focuses principally on the three accounts of the Damascus event, notes how Luke demonstrates Paul's assumption of the testimony of the companions of the Lord at Pisidian Antioch. Paul's personal testimony, then, is seen as rooted in the apostolic testimony, and this is retrospectively confirmed from his very first preaching, 9:20-22. Later, during his trial, Paul is doubly a witness, both in the sense of a preacher of the apostolic testimony, but also in the judicial sense. This latter understanding is developed by Stoller to describe the figure of Paul in Acts as the accused during the trial narrative. From the above studies, it is clear that Paul's role as witness is important in Acts. They tend to overplay one aspect, albeit important, of Paul's complex character to the neglect of others, in order to present a model for imitation or for the encouragement of the church community. The role as witness is viewed as a fixed attribute of Paul once he becomes a disciple. Although Paul is indeed a witness, this role is only gradually realized and in fact evolves, especially in the latter part of Acts. The tendency to group only thematically related elements of Paul's character around key terms such as witness produces harmonized and static portraits. A number of studies, we've heard this over the last few days, examine the parallels between Jesus and Paul. They identify Paul as a Christological figure who witnesses to Jesus in his very person. While these studies highlight the extensive syncresis between Jesus and Paul, the syncresis tends to govern the focus of these studies, and those elements not fruitfully compared or contrasted are often overlooked. These studies also tend to bridge gaps by directly linking common but distantly positioned elements in the narrative. Roloff exemplifies this by noting how the parallelism of Jesus and Paul demonstrates that to share in Jesus' story is to share in his suffering. He thereby posits fulfillment of the prediction of Ananias, 9:16, during Paul's period on trial, just as for Jesus and his trial. The earlier fulfillment is bypassed in favor of what best fits the prediction and syncresis. Thus, the evolution of suffering in Paul's ministry is missed, despite the fact that Roloff views Paul's role as a suffering witness of Jesus Christ as central to his portrait in Acts. While a syncresis with Jesus is certainly present, it emerges over time. The importance of identifying the reasons for the emergence and evolution of this syncresis is often missed. The purpose of these portrayals of Paul as witness or as a Christological figure is diversely viewed depending on the postulated context of Luke's community and the time to which the narrative is referring. For Burchard, Paul is an exemplary but now historic figure of the former original church community, while Leuning views Paul's testimony as reassurance for the present community of believers, whose split with Judaism placed in question the continuity between the church and salvation history. Roloff views Paul as an emblematic figure, symbolizing in his person and destiny the history of the evolution of the church from its Jewish origins to a church mainly comprised of Gentiles, and as such demonstrates the continuity of the present church with its origins. Many of the above authors, Burchard, Leuning, Stoller, and Roloff, make presumptions about the stage of development, ethnic composition, and level of strife within Luke's church community, which are difficult to substantiate. Furthermore, these hypotheses exert a controlling effect on the selection and presentation of material regarding Paul. Those sections where Paul is a central protagonist in episodes and speeches are more suited to didactic and paranetic purposes, and thus are favored over sections where he is in the background, such as summaries. Thus, the attempts to fit the purpose of Paul's portrait into putative contexts of Luke's audience tend to obscure the portrait itself. I pass to the next point, 4.5, Luke's apologetic interests, studies that highlight the legitimation of Paul. Some authors observe apologetic interests in the portrait of Paul and the use by Luke of various legitimation techniques. These authors also assume various historical reconstructions of the church and readership of Acts. Formerly, some viewed Acts as an apologetic work addressed to the Roman authorities or Gentiles, but it's unclear that Acts is addressed to believers, as it would not be understood by outsiders. Since Jervell, most take into consideration the conflictual dynamic between Christians and Jews in the separation of the church from Judaism. For Jervell, the presentation of Paul is as a true teacher of Israel and faithful Jew, while his opponents are blasphemers. Paul is repeatedly confirmed by various legitimating techniques. Chief among these is his portrayal as a wonder worker. The miracles both validate and exemplify his message and provide the occasion for his preaching and for his audience to come to belief. The miracle's legitimating function is magnified through the close association with the earlier miracles of Jesus, the 12 and Stephen. The recounting of specific miracles and their repeated inclusion in summaries reinforces this aspect of Paul's ministry, and especially how God works in and through him. The performance of miracles is only one of many legitimating techniques employed by Luke for Paul. The basic Jewish prophetic prediction and fulfillment model is used together with a selection of Hellenistic literary legitimating techniques: divine approval, access to divine power, high motivation, benefiting others, possession of a high level of culture, adherence to ancient tradition. And these are from Brawley. One of the strongest legitimating techniques is that of the extensive syncresis of Paul with Jesus and with the major figures in the church, such as Peter, Stephen, Philip, and Barnabas, who themselves are in syncresis with Jesus. Studies tend to emphasize the later clearer parallels from the first missionary journey onwards, but these are well prepared by the early events in Paul's life as a disciple of the Lord, where his future closeness with Jesus is clearly foretold, 9:15 to 16, and exemplified in his preaching, 9:20, 22, verses 27, 28, and 11:26. Paul, the faithful disciple, retraces the example of Jesus, and he thus represents Jesus to those he encounters on his mission. Clarke examines the parallels between Paul and the apostles, especially Peter, and again focuses on the more obvious parallels from Acts 13 onwards. However, he devotes significant attention to the figure of Barnabas, which covers the earlier period of Paul's career. The tendency to look to the apologetic purpose leads Clarke to view Barnabas' function as linking Paul with the apostles and as being more a symbol of continuity and unity for the church. In fact, Barnabas does much more. He inducts Paul into various roles, introduces him to diverse individuals and groups within the church, and later joins him in almost all of the diverse activities of the missionary journey for much of the time. Most recently, Rossi has examined through the lens of Luke's use of the literary technique of syncresis, Paul and Peter, showing them as faithful as Jesus before them to the religion of their fathers, but also faithful in their teaching and life to their master. Paul and Peter, therefore, serve as exemplary figures for the readers of all time. These studies, while they identify useful narrative strategies employed to legitimate Paul, focus only on the positive aspects of his character, and the possible negative or even neutral aspects, the delays, hesitations, gaps, are not readily detected in studies focused on apologetic and legitimating techniques. Such studies would also lead to a partial portrait of Paul. 4.6, studies that focus on the end of Acts. This is quite a live debate at the moment. The end of Acts has received significant attention in recent times. There has been a shift from seeing the ending as abrupt and incomplete to viewing it as deliberate and purposeful. Studies have shifted from asking why Acts ends as it does, cor, to asking how, quo modo, does Acts end. While literary studies deftly demonstrate the complementary elements of closure and openness, they tend to underplay the figure of Paul, perhaps in reaction to the multitude of earlier hypotheses on Paul's fate and on why Luke failed to speak of it, or because of an emphasis on the proclamation, the word, rather than the proclaimer. For some, the failure to provide a conclusion to the story of Paul is explained as an expected ancient literary or rhetorical practice. Theological studies which focus on the status of the mission to the ends of the earth and of the relationship with Israel also tend to treat of Paul only tangentially. Nevertheless, the unfinished story of Paul at the end of Acts continues to attract attention. The portrait of Paul in Rome is viewed as the culmination of the rejected Deuteronomistic prophet motif, who fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah in preaching to a stubborn people, Acts 28, 25 to 28. Margaret notes that the final summary, Acts 28, 30 to 31, concludes the biography of Paul, but also portrays him as an exemplary figure, a pastor and evangelist, who, although a prisoner, preaches, if not to the ends of the earth, at least to all, Jews and Gentiles, who come to him. Through this final summary, the narrative world connects with the world of the readers, who are thereby invited to reconstitute in their lives the final portrait of Paul. Aletti views Paul, following the example of the risen Jesus in Luke 24, as an authorized interpreter of Scripture and of God's ultimate plan of salvation. Furthermore, the initial episode of Jesus' ministry in the synagogue at Nazareth and the final reported episodes of Paul's preaching hold together the chain of parallels between Jesus and Paul that run through the narrative. Following Goulder, Aletti detects a specific Lucan typology whereby Jesus, who fills the prefiguration of many Old Testament prophets, becomes in turn the prototype for his disciples, and in particular Paul. The recent monograph of my predecessor, Landi, this morning, drawing together the fruits of recent literary and narrative analysis, views the Lord's nocturnal revelation to Paul as a key element in his portrayal. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness also in Rome. Paul's witness throughout his trial, and especially in Rome, is divinely necessary. And the preceding narrative portrays him as a fitting chosen instrument to witness to the Lord in his person and in his ministry to all, Jews and Gentiles. Paul is thereby an emblematic figure for the readers of Acts to imitate, and so fulfill the programmatic statement of Acts 1:8. Significant attention has been given to Paul in the sea voyage and Malta episode of the final 2 chapters of Acts. The manner of Paul's survival from the shipwreck and from the snake bite strongly legitimate him. Not only St. Patrick, but Paul. The Acts concludes with the vindicated Paul witnessing to Christ and as Christ to all. I break to look now to where we might be going next. So number 5, contemporary characterization in Paul, opportunities and challenges. Many literary and narrative studies of character discern very different Lucan portraits of Paul, and this is symptomatic of the plurality of current approaches to characterization. Some key advances in characterization techniques have been made regarding the importance of the extra-textual repertoire and sequence in a first-time reading by John Darr, which allows for the evolution of the character to be traced through narrative. Macnamara employed this method, has discerned a dynamic portrait of Paul from Acts 7:58 to 15:41. A very comprehensive model has been proposed by Cornelius Benema, who has employed it for Peter in Acts. The characterization of ways in which characters become known to readers proposed by Malbon, characters are known by what they say and by what they do, and by what others, the narrator and other characters, say and do too, about or in relation to them, holds promise, but as yet has not been applied to Paul in Acts. It may provide a focused means for an examination of Paul's full life and mission in Acts, which too often is treated in more manageable sections, but which thereby distort the fuller portrait. The study of Skinner, Matthew Skinner, which examined the narrative function of the custody settings of Paul in Acts 21:28, although limited in scope, demonstrates the potential of narrative methods of characterization for Paul in Acts. There is certainly no consensus on methods of characterization. A significant difficulty is that the focus has moved from the author and the text to readers, who are multiple, changing, and varied. The diversity of assumed readers in the approach to characterization has led to a cacophony of discordant portraits of many New Testament figures, and within Luke Acts, notably the Pharisees and women. A comparable cacophony is heard in the diverse portraits of the Lucan Paul. Section 6, Summary of the State of the Research. From the 1970s onwards, studies of Paul in Acts have tended to select sections of the narrative or to isolate a paranetic or apologetic purpose of the narrator, which is seen as governing the construction of Paul's portrait. The tendency of redaction scholars to only examine sections of the text has persisted even among those who practice narrative criticism. With the omission of the summaries which focus on church life, Paul's role therein is missed. Paul is too hastily understood in the first half of Acts as a missionary, either to Jews, Jervell and Brawley, or to Gentiles, Leuning, and in the latter half as a witness, either persecuted, Maddox, Rosenblatt and Wilson, or exalted, Lentz and Skinner, or Christological, Rolla, Folletti and Landi. For many, he is an outstanding figure, when in fact he is frequently portrayed in summaries in partnership with Barnabas or as one of a group of leaders within a church in the first half of Acts. It is small wonder, then, that such studies of Paul find him to be an identifying, margara, or emblematic figure for the Christianity of his time. The treatment of isolated sections of the text where Paul is prominent leads to the generalizing tendency of the earlier generation of scholars. Beauvon noted already in the mid-1970s that although the figure of Paul has consistently attracted attention from scholars, no comprehensive study has been published on the figure of Paul in Acts. One recent study covers the ministry and mission of Paul from his first emergence at the stoning of Stephen to his separation from Barnabas. And a few studies cover the period in Roman custody. These studies cover much of Paul's life and ministry in Acts, and yet the ecclesial figure discerned for the former study should be nuanced by the witness on trial and vice versa for a full rather than a partial Lucan portrait of Paul to emerge. Beauvon's point still stands. Just for now, there is, I just heard, since I've come here, a project to do a study on the middle section, and I'm very much looking forward to the fruits of that research. So we may get closer to closing the hole in the research that Beauvon identified. Thank you very much.